Today's theme of industrialization, one of the outcomes of that was a creation of a class system, right, of different social classes. And so, today we're going to continue on with our discussion of industrialization and these central questions, right? To what extent was America the land of opportunity for people of Mexican descent specifically? Okay, so so yesterday was kind of more of the macro, kind of bigger picture of what was happening with industrialization, and now today we're going to get focused on the Mexican population and what role did race play in this whole economic system? Was race a factor? You know, and so we'll go through those questions today. And as you do the readings, again, keep in mind those questions and help guide you as you read, right? And then some key concepts we'll be talking about. Okay, labor stratification, something called dual wage system, and debt peonage. Some of you might remember that idea. Okay. All right. We good? Okay. So that's kind of our game plan today. Starting with. Let's talk about a changing population in the Southwest. Okay, so as we understood with our overview lecture and discussing the Mexican-American War and its aftermath, right? We know that here in the Southwest, especially here in California, for example, after the 1850s, we know that we had the gold rush here in California, and what did that mean beyond like laws being passed against Mexican people? Well, you saw a rapid shift in the population, and the reason why it's called the gold rush is people rushed to come over here, right? And almost overnight, white settlers flooded to the western states, including this state here, California, and just to give you an example, and this is straight out of Acuña's book, the population, the Mexican population in 1850, at the time of the gold rush, was estimated at 1,331. 30 years later, that increased, okay, but pretty moderately, right? Increased to a population of about 2,231, okay? If you look at the Anglo population during that same period, their population explodes, right? From just a small 300 Anglos to over 8,000 by 1880. Okay, and so that's just one little example of the demographic shift that was unfolding and the rapid changes that industrialization was bringing, not just to the East Coast, but also now to the West Coast. Okay. And of course, throughout the Southwest, industrialization brought a lot of change for the Mexican population, a Mexican population that had been here prior to the Mexican-American War, living mostly in a rural rancho lifestyle, right? And of course, the reality of having your lands taken, and now you are displaced, is going to create some new realities. So that the Mexican population now, well, let's just take a guess. How do you suppose they end up being affected by industrialization now? Knowing what we know about industrialization, the division of labor, the class structure, right? Where would they fit in that diagram of, the upper class, middle, and lower working class? Ricardo, what do you think?
Where do they fit?
Yeah. Yeah, at the very bottom. I mean, they're displaced of their lands, and now, of course, we'll see how, as Acuña describes, they end up making up this sort of colonial labor force. The Chicano-Mexicano population becomes concentrated into these least desirable jobs within the working class. What Marx referred to now as kind of the process of proletarianization. In other words, the process by which people end up as part of that working class. Okay, and as you do the readings in Acuña, there's basically 4 categories that we can see within that working class, 4 categories of employment Mexican people found themselves relegated to. Okay. The first being the railroads, right? And what kind of jobs? Like chief engineer for the trains? What kind of work do you think? Yeah, building the railroad. Okay. Mines. Are we still talking about gold mining as we get past into the 1880s and 90s? Now the gold rush is over. What kind of mining do you suppose?
Natural resources.
Yeah, the mineral mining, right? So like, particularly like if you read in that chapter on Arizona, the mining operations in that state became critical to industrialization, like in the copper mines, and of course, coal in addition. And then agriculture, ranching jobs, right? Doing farm work. And then, of course, urban occupations, construction projects. With the growth of cities, and we'll talk about urbanization later, you'll see that the growth of major cities, creates jobs, right? You're going to have major construction projects, buildings, roads, freeways, bridges, okay, that kind of thing. Okay. And over the next, beyond to the turn of the century, by 1920s, we see, the automobile, right? So, of course, you're going to have roads needed for that. So, and just to think about sort of the segmentation of our labor force, right? Labor force becomes segmented along ethnic and racial lines, you're really maintaining yourself in a subordinated position. So if what we say is true, and if you think back to that triangle, right, from yesterday, and if we see the Mexican population concentrated here in the working class, okay, then the question becomes, to what extent did they have access to what we call upward mobility, right? And when we talk about upward mobility, that's just a phrase to refer to the idea that if you are upwardly mobile, you are able to move up the economic ladder, right? And as we look at this picture of what happened for the Mexican population, do you think they had upward mobility? In other words, you started working on the railroad tracks, or you started working in the fields. Do they eventually move up and out of those jobs? Or do they get stuck in those kinds of jobs? Yeah. And that's kind of this idea of being maintained in your subordinate position, right? And that kind of brings us to one of the key concepts. Can we go to the next one? Okay. Labor stratification. Okay, it's a fancy way. Let's look at the book definition here first, and then we'll kind of break it up. The practice of classifying certain types of jobs as suited for minorities and other non-minorities with little or no opportunity for upward mobility, okay? To be economically marginalized. Okay, so rather than have your ability to go up the economic ladder, you are stratified, right? Meaning you are marginalized to this working class position. Okay, and there's our graphic. Okay. And we'll talk about the ways in which stratification happens. Okay. We talk about it nowadays. Like you hear people sometimes talk about dead-end jobs, right? What would be considered like a dead-end job? Why do we call them a dead-end job? There's no exit. You're kind of stuck. Yeah. What kind of jobs, Manny, would those be?
I was going to say jobs that have no upward mobility.
Yeah, jobs that have no upward mobility, right? Like a lot of service sector jobs, right? Waitressing, working at a gas station, working in the fast food industry, right? Michael, you were going to say something?
Yeah, janitorial work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are jobs that, do you want to have these jobs for a long time? No. These are jobs that are probably good for, okay, when you're in college, right? And you might have these jobs that might help out a little bit, right? But eventually these are jobs that you typically want to leave behind, right? What happens if you're not able to leave these jobs behind? But that's all there is, right? And that's what it means to be labor stratified, right? To be in this situation where you have little or no room for upward mobility. Okay, and so we could talk about labor stratification, and you suppose that at that time, race was also a factor? Yeah, absolutely. And so we can talk about not just labor stratification, but even a racial stratification. Okay. And they kind of went hand in hand. In other words, the majority of the population of people of color, whether you were African American, Chinese, Mexican, Filipinos, etc., here in the Southwest, you saw that group or those groups concentrated within the working class as an exploitable labor force. Okay. And there's really a history of these populations that are disenfranchised and marginalized, whether it's Native Americans who saw their lands appropriated and either victims of genocide or put on reservations, restrictive laws against the Chinese, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, or with the Japanese, the Gentleman's Agreement in 1906 that banned their migration. There was certainly an element of race that played a role, not just in who could get which jobs, but even who could come to this country. And in reality, the fact that there were restrictions, for example, on the Chinese and the Japanese by the late 1800s, many employers, and especially in the Southwest, began to turn their eyeballs towards recruiting Mexican laborers as another source of exploitable labor. If you were an employer that relied, for example, on the Chinese workers, and there were Chinese laborers that, for example, here in California that worked on the Central Pacific, on the railroads. And then with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all Chinese from coming here. Now, if you were an employer and no longer do you have access to Chinese workers because they're no longer allowed to come in, what are you going to do? You're going to turn to Mexicans, right? You're going to turn to another group of labor. So reality is Mexican people now found themselves recruited to work. Now, there was a strong desire for cheap labor. Was there necessarily a need? Well, you have to kind of think a bit about it from a capitalist point of view, right? If you're an employer, let's say you owned a company, what would you want to have? Not enough workers to work for you? Just barely enough workers? Or would you want to have more than enough workers? What would you want to have? More than enough. Why, John?
The more you have, the faster things become.
Okay. What else can you do if you have more than enough workers, more than what you need? Okay.
You could get more production and stuff.
Okay, you can get more production, but you only need so many. But why would you want to have some that you don't even need?
Less pay for the workers. The vast majority of workers working do the same thing.
Okay.
The minimum wage would be very low.
You could keep the wages down? Could you? Mike, what were you going to say? Yeah. Oh, you don't like working in this factory? Oh, you think you're not being paid? Okay, you're fired. Let's hire that guy. He's unemployed over there, right? So absolutely, it was desirable if you were, thinking like a good capitalist, right? You were wanting to have a reservoir of unemployed, underemployed, or people who are, you're able to suppress wages, right? And historically, And many have argued this is why perhaps we've never had like a zero unemployment, for example, right? That you are able to keep workers in a situation where they can be exploited because you have other people who are out of work. Okay, and a lot of industrialists, a lot of businesses thrived off of this idea. Okay, and we can look at the different these different types of employment and see where a lot of this played out. And there was a lot of strong anti-Chinese movement, actually. Basically, it was let's bring them in, let's have them work for us. But then it was like, oh, there's too many of them, And xenophobic reactions in the United States led to these laws being passed, and the Chinese were seen now as not as a source of labor, but now as a threat. Okay, a threat to American purity of blood, and so the anti-Chinese movement begins, right? And that ultimately served to feed the desire for Mexican laborers. Okay, so let's talk about each of these jobs, each of these categories. Let's start with farm work. Okay, let's start with farm work, and talk a little bit about what it was like to be a farm worker. Okay, first of all, you should understand that industrialization changed how farm work was done. Okay, back in the day, before industrialization, you had mom and pop farms, right? People had a little plot of land and they grew their crops, and you picked your crops and you maybe had some for yourself, but then you maybe took some to a local market and you sold it, right? With industrialization, though, came large-scale harvesting and massive, large-scale production, right? Big companies now crush small farmers. A lot of inventions and technology like irrigation techniques, improvements in moving water around, where before industrialization certain lands were not suitable for growing crops. Well, with irrigation techniques, you could bring fresh water to lands that were previously very dry, and now all of a sudden you could bring these waterways and monopolize large areas of land and take control of the water even. Believe it or not, a lot of these industrialists took a lot of their techniques of how to irrigate from Mexican farmers who had lived in the Southwest for many years. But water was significantly important for farming. Think of places like Arizona, right? With the advent of on the railroad, for example, industrialization changed things. Something as simple as the invention of the refrigerated train car. Think about that for a moment, right? A train car that is refrigerated. What could that do for you? Mm-hmm. Now you could transport fruits and vegetables across state lines, and they won't rot, right? And all of a sudden, if you were a farmer here in California, well, now all of a sudden the market is opened up for you, and you can sell your produce not just to the local market, but and transport it across state lines. Okay? And so we saw the transformation of the pastoral kind of and cattle economy of what Mexico once was, right? A rancho lifestyle to now a mega ag business, and agricultural businesses begin to be established, and mechanization, even and to this day, of course, we see this. You guys see this here in California, right? Agriculture is a multi-million-dollar a year industry from this state, right? And how many of you have ever driven along the freeway and see the fields on the side of the road, right? And right, and you see the fields. Typically, what do you see? You see a field of one crop, right? One crop being picked, whatever it is, asparagus, 30 acres of whatever, strawberries, etc. And in a lot of ways, a lot of this had to do with mechanization, and now all of a sudden, you went to kind of a monoculture of harvesting. Not necessarily, by the way, the best way to use the land, okay? But that's the way businesses wanted to operate, okay? All right, so for the Mexicano population, let's talk about the nature of farm work, okay? The nature of farm work. What would it be like to be a farm worker? Heck, what would it be like to be a farm worker on a day like today? Because are farm workers working right now as we speak? What do you think that's like? Yeah, we're in a nice air-conditioned room right now. I know some of you came in complaining about the heat. Imagine working all day long under the sun, right? And so for farm workers, you had to deal with the fact that you weren't working in a nice office building, but you're working outdoors under the elements. And as a farm worker, many Mexicanos resorted to working in the fields. I mean, if you were displaced of your lands and so forth, and now you're looking for work, you're going to do the work that you needed for survival, right? And so they got hired on. Now, as a farm worker, are you guaranteed to have a job year-round? No. One of the big characteristics of farm work is that it's seasonal. Okay, whatever crop you're picking, it's in season only during certain months, right? And after the crops are picked and the season is over, you're out of a job, right? You're out of a job, and now what do you do? Okay. Well, typically for farm workers, they often had to migrate and go somewhere else, another community, another city, somewhere else where they could find work. And oftentimes they ended up in another farming town where there was other crops that were in season to be picked, right? And so Mexican farm workers became what we call migratory farm workers, right? And they often had to follow what we call in Spanish the corrida, right? Not the corrido from songs, right? But the corrida is a term used to mean the migrant circuit or the migrant stream. And they already they knew what was in season. So you might start, for example, here in California picking lettuce, and then you end up going to Texas to pick cotton, and then maybe go to the Midwest to pick sugar beets, and then you kind of do a full circle and come back around again for the next season. Okay, employers who own these big farms, what many like people like Chicano authors like Francisco Jimenez and others, they refer to these as the factories in the fields, right? Because you had now large scale, like assembly line, picking whatever there is to pick, right, out there. And by the way, how many of you here have had experiences working in the fields before? Like here in the United States? Nobody? You're all city people here? Okay. All right. See, when I grew up in the Salinas Valley, I come from a farm working family. Both my parents had experiences working in the fields. And I remember in the summer months, my mother would say, all right, you guys want school clothes when school starts? Okay, let's go. And she would take us out to the fields to pick strawberries. At that time, strawberries was one of the industries that did allow children to pick. And so there I was out there in the strawberry fields picking strawberries with my brothers and sisters. And I always remember one experience. I was kind of young, so I remember some of it. But I remember it was hot, and I remembered it was a long day. And I remember picking strawberries and putting them in a crate. And I remember just seeing these big, bright, red, juicy-looking strawberries. And there was no water faucet anywhere, right? And after a while, I was like, right, I'm thirsty. And I started eating some of them, right? And the story my siblings always remind me of is when I was eating too many strawberries, got sick to my stomach. They sent me to the car to go wait, and they tease me about it now. But I got the best of it because at the end of the day, my mom would split up whatever we earned amongst all of us evenly, even if I didn't pick what they picked. When you're a farm worker, how do you get paid? You get paid by the hour? Are you paid salary? How are you paid? By how much you pick. By the box, by the crate, by the bucket, whatever it is, right? By the pound, etc. And so typically when you see farm workers working, they're often working very quickly, right? Because you want to pick as much as you can, as quickly as you can, so that you can make it worth your time out there, right? And it's back-breaking work, right? And in case you're wondering, and of course at this time now we're talking, what, late 1800s, early 1900s. This was what I often refer to as, this was BC, before Chavez. Okay, so the labor laws were much, much fewer, right? And there were, and of course there were numerous cases of reported illnesses, heat-related illness, dehydration, workers collapsing in the fields. Employers back then, industrialists who ran big farms, they didn't even see their workers on the fields as employees. They were not treated as such. They were thought of as an expense, And you can go back and look at some of the literature on this, and where these industrialists that own big farms, they listed all their inventory and expenses, so they would have like, 30 pounds of seeds, 20 pounds of fertilizer, 100 Mexicans, like it was just sort of, you were an expense, and as a good capitalist, you want to keep your expenses down, right? And so, but many employers began to talk openly about how, well, Mexicans are made to do farm work. We're shorter, we're closer to the ground, we don't have to bend over as far. And the argument throughout the Southwest amongst ag company owners was this idea that Mexican people were genetically predisposed to be farm workers, not to be business owners. As evidenced by this quote as an example from a Dr. George Clements of the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce Agricultural Department. Due to their crouching and bending habits, the Oriental and Mexican are suited to tasks in the fields. Whites are physically unable to adapt themselves to such work. Right? And this sentiment was kind of par for the course. In other words, this was very commonly held idea amongst the wealthy industrialists, that there were certain people made to be the workers. Okay. And because you were oftentimes exploited, you were paid low wages. Workers often lived in what were called migrant labor camps. You didn't have a permanent place to call home because you were having to pack up and move after the job was done, right? And so it was a tough life to be a migratory farm worker. Okay. Workers were also not paid the same wages as a white worker. You were paid on what they called a dual wage system, okay, which was just a fancy way to say two pay scales. Okay, there was one pay scale if you were a white worker, and then if you were a non-white worker, there was another pay scale. It was typically half of the wage of the white worker. Okay. With that reality, most Mexican farm workers often had to resort to entire families out in the fields, right? So you couldn't have just dad out there working, mom at home. No, women, such as you see here, women and children out working to make ends meet. Because of the kind of exploitation that was occurring. Check it out in Acuña because he gives you several examples in his book of the dual wage system. And you might think, well, this really hurt Mexican workers. Yeah, it did, of course. Any non-white worker was paid half the wages of white workers now. But it also affected white workers in an interesting way. Because when white workers complained to the boss, I want to get paid more, the bosses would often reject their request for a pay raise. And one of the common things that they would tell the white workers is what? At least, yeah, at least you have it better than them, right? So stop complaining, right? And what this often did was create resentment, right? Where Mexican workers were seen as suppressing the wages and were oftentimes the targets of prejudiced attitudes from white workers. All right, so just to kind of recap the characteristics of farm work. Okay, I mentioned the dual wage system, right? 2 pay scales, seasonal work, right? The work was temporary. Now let's talk about what does it mean to be a temporary resident of a community, right? Can you ever fully integrate yourself into the life of a community if you're temporary? No, you can't. Okay. What is it means to be a seasonal worker, right? And what does it mean to live in a farm labor camp, right? Oftentimes, those labor camps were located on the property owned by your employer, right? The grower who owned the fields owns the land that you are setting up your camp. Okay. Now, what impact do you think that has on you? Imagine that you lived on property that was owned by your boss. What do you think that meant? They were owned too. Yeah, doesn't that put you kind of in a really vulnerable position to be working on land for an employer and then living on that same land? Absolutely. Employers oftentimes charged you room and board. They knew how much you were getting paid, and sometimes they took advantage of that. Sometimes they even charged you more than you could afford. Sometimes they would just tell you, you know what, I'm going to take it out of your next month's pay. And so you were kind of locked in there. You were isolated. You were in a rural farm camp where you're not nearby any major city. You feel very isolated and very vulnerable. And it's much easier to exploit you, right? If you are isolated off. The kind of poverty endured by farm workers at this time, early 1900s, impacted family life, right? If you were a child growing up in a migrant family like this, you forget about stability of home, stability of being in the same school. You were constantly moving from place to place. Okay. And throughout the Southwest, you found the same situation, whatever the crop was, whatever location. Okay. And all of these things combine to create this idea of labor stratification, right? Easy or difficult to have upward mobility given these conditions? Right? Very, very difficult to impossible. Right? When you're living hand to mouth. Okay. All right. Can we go to the next slide? We good? All right. Just an image. This is a migrant labor camp in Kansas in 1918. Okay, it gives you an idea what we're talking about here. Okay. All right, so agriculture. Read about that in your readings from Acuna. Read about the growth of crop production. Okay, let's jump over to the mining operations. Okay, Los Mineros. What would it have been like to be a miner? What would it be like to be a miner back then? Raise your hand if you'd like to do it. Okay, Manny? What kind of working conditions might you have if you were a miner? Hazardous conditions, absolutely. You're working in confined spaces. If you know anything about the history of mining in this country, right, you oftentimes are working with explosives, right? Dynamite. You're in caves, in dark, confined spaces, right? And oftentimes it was very dangerous. There were cave-ins, and you could be trapped alive or killed with a collapsing cave or whatever, right? Back then, there were very few labor laws. There was very few safety requirements, for example. If you were a Mexican worker, oftentimes you were forced to work alone in the mines, which was very dangerous, right? as opposed to working together with other workers. Okay? In the Southwest, the most common places you would be at would be in the mines of Arizona, the copper mines. Okay, and there's a lot of history there. As a matter of fact, if we were learning this Mexican American history class, it was being taught. Let's say we were in Arizona. Chances are, many of you students of Mexican descent might even have, family members that had worked in the mines. Okay, that would have been a common thing. Okay, and what do we know about miners? Is they typically have shorter lifespans. Okay, largely because you're breathing in bad air. Okay. And of course, about in coal mining, for example, there's the coal dust and black lung disease, right? But in the same vein, in the copper mines, you're breathing in, and this stuff just stays in your lungs, and it's very, very dangerous, very bad for you. Okay, and workers in the mines were also subject to dual wage. Typically, the mining operations were sometimes out there in the middle of nowhere. And company owners would take a crew of workers out there, and maybe you're there for a few weeks or whatever, right? And so they would set up a makeshift, town. Actually, they called them company towns. It would be a place where they would offer you, room and board, and they would set up, a general store or a post office, or, and so it was all these facilities that were, run by the company. And, the most notorious one, and you could read about in the chapter on Arizona, is the Dodge Phelps Company. Okay, the Dodge Phelps Company was, was just one of the largest ones, but it was also one of the more notoriously abusive and exploitive companies. Okay. Did workers ever try to go on strike? Did they ever try to fight back, do you think? Oh yeah, absolutely. Contrary to the mythology that Mexicans, were just asleep under a cactus with a big sombrero over our heads and never stood up for our rights, and it wasn't until Chavez came around. That's not true. Okay, we know that in the early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, some of the most famous strikes that took place were here in the Southwest involving Mexican workers, whether it was in the fields, with a wildcat strike where workers spontaneously went off the job, or in the mines. And a wildcat strike was a spontaneous strike. Maybe something happened. Maybe, Ricardo, you were out there in the mines and one of your good friends gets hurt and needs medical attention or whatever. And the boss comes in and says, hey, just go home, and you guys go back to work, and really does not do anything to help. And the workers get upset, right? And you can imagine they might just throw down the picks and the shovels and say, ya basta, enough is enough. We're walking off. What would happen then? Oftentimes you're just fired. Okay? Or law enforcement, local law enforcement would be brought in. Okay. If you're rich and you're powerful, do you have influence with the local police force, do you think? Yeah. And it was pretty bad. Here's another image here of some miners. Right? Okay. Working conditions were pretty bad. If you ever get an opportunity, there's a great documentary I used to use called Los Mineros, about the miners of the Dodge Phelps Company, and one incident that kind of jumps out at me is a story of a strike that took place against the Dodge Phelps Company. See, what they would do is they would set up these like a town, right, company-owned town, right, and if you were a miner, you wouldn't necessarily get paid with real money. They would use what were called scrips. Okay, a scrip was like a coupon, basically. A scrip was a redeemable coupon. So you could, instead of getting money, you'd get paid with a scrip, and then you would go to the company-owned businesses where you could get your food, and you could use these coupons to purchase whatever you needed to get, right? And the bosses oftentimes used that to their advantage. Because oftentimes your pay was so low, you couldn't afford the food, you couldn't afford the room and board and all that stuff, and you ended up in debt. The companies would extend credit to you. You know, well, we'll give you credit and you can pay it back, and at the end of the month, your pay was not enough to pay back what you owed. Right? What does this sound like, by the way? Yeah, debt peonage. Exactly, debt peonage. And that's exactly what it was. Right? Workers were stuck in a kind of a credit system where at the end of you're working for the company and you owe them. They don't owe you. Yeah. And so workers went on strike, right? And sometimes these strike actions, and you might see where people are picketing, right? And the employers, well, we need the mining operations to keep going, and so they would bring in replacement workers, right? People who are not working will replace you, and violence oftentimes would break out at these work sites where replacement workers are being brought in. Striking workers want to prevent them from going in, because remember, if you go on strike, what makes your strike effective? Idana? If nobody works, right, there's no production. And there's no production, the owners are not making any profits, right? And so for your strike to be successful, you have to bring production to a halt, to a standstill, right? And so this was a huge threat to those wealthy business people, right? So they oftentimes would bring replacement workers in. And there's a story in Arizona of the Dodge Phelps Company bringing where they rounded up all these workers, and they were on strike. You know, they rounded them up and they threw them on a train car, on a box car. You know, the train went into the middle of the Arizona desert, and they just dropped them off out there in the middle of nowhere as a way to break up the strike action, right? As you can imagine, a lot of them didn't make it back. You know, and so, you know, these industrialists, these business owners, they used everything in their power to suppress any kind of unionization or strikes that took place. Okay, and workers did not get any compensation for injuries. There was no paid leave, no health insurance. You're breathing in toxic fumes, and of course, when you typically learn the dominant narrative of industrialization, you learn about the copper, you learn about the telegraph, yeah. But remember, those telegraph lines are made of what? Copper is used a lot, right? And very little attention is ever paid to the fact that there were Mexican miners that were, because of their efforts and their work, they were contributing to this industrial period, right? The industrialization and all this advancement that was happening, in that regard. Okay. And this is just an image here. How many of you have been to the Almaden mines here in San Jose? Okay, Mike, you have? What do you see out there?
Like ruins,
Mm-hmm.
what's left of the mines,
Mm-hmm.
and there's just like a post that explains what was there.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can't go in there now. I mean, it's just you could try, right? You could, very dangerous, so don't. But
Where is it located here in San Jose?
yeah, where is it at? Like
Um,
Almaden?
yeah.
Yeah, you can find them. They do tour. You could do tours and go check. I mean, what you can, but just to give you the idea that it existed. Here's just an image of company representatives. A lot of people made profit off of this. Okay, there was one famous cat that you could read about, I think in Zin and in Acuña. This guy Sylvester Maury of the Maury Silver Mines in Arizona. And this is what he said. The lower class of Mexican with the Opata and the Yaqui Indians are docile, faithful, good servants, capable of strong attachment when firmly and kindly treated. They have been peons for generations. They will always remain so, as it is their natural condition. Okay. And so again, we hear this theme, right? That the idea, the argument being made that Mexican people were designed for manual labor work, although you had a poor working white class also of white workers, you also had, in a lot of these jobs, typically white workers were given the more skilled jobs, the jobs that didn't, maybe machine operator, those kinds of jobs where maybe it wasn't as labor intensive, those were typically reserved for white workers. Okay, but the grunt work, the hard labor, the pick and shovel work, and those kinds of jobs were typically given to you were black worker, Mexican, Chinese, etc. Okay. All right, so just to sum up then, the characteristics of mining, where you also had the dual wage, we mentioned debt peonage, and the idea of a company-owned town. Okay, and you could read some of these examples of some of these, historical examples that Acuna gives you in the readings. All right, any questions on mining? Okay, there's 4, right? So we got through 2. Let's go to the railroads. Let's talk about the railroads, because the railroads was a big deal, right? The railroads were a huge deal, if you stop and think about it, especially the transcontinental, right? When we finally were able to have a railroad track that went from the east coast of the United States all the way to the west coast. That was a major accomplishment, right? And it's always celebrated in their history books, and as evidence of, American progress, right? And it's interesting because, if you look at some of the traditional history books, when they talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, they always show you the company owners, people like Cornelius Vanderbilt. I always remember there's this famous photograph, I should try to track it down, of when they made the connection of the rail lines, from east to west. And they had a big ceremony, and these company owners are out there, and there's this picture of these old white guys with the big top hats and the white beards and the suits, and they're celebrating, and they're there for the photo op, right, to take the picture. And I think they had this big ceremony where with the mallet they put the last spike, connecting the rail lines, right? Well, there's a story underneath that story, right? There's a hidden story to this. At that celebration, at that ceremony of celebrating this great accomplishment in American history, there was a whole crew of Chinese workers that had been working on that railroad track who were not allowed to be in the photo. Okay. So there's completely left out, right? So then you start learning your history about the Transcontinental, and who did it? Well, you don't see them, those people, Who did it? You're led to believe that it was these great company owners, right? And that's what Zinn in his book is so critical of, right? This idea of it's top-down history that you get, right? You get a story from the perspective of those wealthy industrialists, but who did the back-breaking work? Right? Who did the back-breaking work? And so, the Iron Horse, as they called it, right? You see in this, you see what I'm talking about here, right? You see mostly white men, right? And these are the kinds of images you see in traditional history textbooks, right? And so when we start thinking about, the Chinese, Asian Americans, and Mexican Americans in history, we're completely left out of the story here. Right? And as one of my favorite historians, Ronald Takaki, in his book A Different Mirror, History of Multicultural America, he puts it very plainly. It's like looking in a mirror and not seeing yourself, right? So for young students who, Mexican American students, Asian American students, you're looking at your history books, and where are we, right? Where are we represented? We're not. Okay? And this is part of the problem, right? And so you see those images. What you don't see are images like this one. These 2 Mexican women working on the railroad, right? Did it happen? Yeah. Okay. Would it make a difference if we were included in the history books, do you think? Wow. So were Mexican people employed in the railroad? Yes, absolutely. They worked on what they call in Spanish el traque, the track. A lot of them were a lot of Mexican people were recruited to go work on el traque, and there are stories where Mexican workers didn't know what was traque. What's that? One worker thought it was a fancy department store that I was going to go work at, and they found out traque, it was the railroad tracks, and it was anything but a glamorous job, right? You think about the railroads. You think about the railroads. If you've ever been driving down the freeway and you see the railroad tracks kind of going alongside the road for miles and miles, right? Do you ever stop and think how much labor was needed to lay all those miles and miles of track? How many workers were used for that? Okay. It's a fascinating story, right? This one is kind of close to me. My grandfather worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad down in Southern California in the early 1900s. He was born in 1899, right? 1899. So in the 1920s, he was in his 20s. He was a young man at a time when the railroads were in full swing and workers were being recruited for the Southern Pacific, the Central, for the Santa Fe, and all these different companies that were working on laying track. And I've always believed that the railroad tracks were, if there's any one thing you could point to, was the backbone of industrialization, it's got to be the railroads, right? You think about it. Not just for transporting people, but for transporting what? Goods, raw materials, etc., right? Everything and anything you transport now by rail. Okay? It really dramatically shifted things in this country, okay? The railroads. Okay? And those that worked on the railroads, the traqueros, as they called them, right? Out there in the middle of nowhere, again, just like miners, right? And you might be wondering, well, did the railroad companies, did they set up like company towns like the mining companies did? Yeah. And they exploited the workers in the same way? Yeah. Was there dual wage? Yeah, all that stuff. See, a lot of industrialists, they shared their strategies and approaches for maximizing profits oftentimes with each other. Mexican railway workers were exploited, poorly paid in the construction, repair, and maintenance of tracks, and oftentimes paid very, very, very low. We could even call it, slave wage. Right? Typically, and you could check it out in the readings from Occupied America. $30 a month for Mexican and Mexican Americans, 12 to 14-hour shifts, while Anglo counterparts earned $60 to $70 on average. That gives you an idea of the dual wage system. Yeah, Mike.
Anglo counterparts work the same amount of hours?
Yeah, they might. They might, but oftentimes, like I said, the more skilled jobs, the less strenuous jobs were often reserved for whites only. So you might not, necessarily be working alongside the Mexican worker. There were certain privileges if you were a white worker versus if you were a non-white worker. And I think, and check it out with the readings, because Acuna gives you some interesting statistics, like thousands of miles of railroad tracks, and there was a recruitment of thousands of workers per month to work on these railroad tracks. Major projects, right? Major projects. I think about this sometimes because you hear the current president over there talking about infrastructure, right, and the need to rebuild the roads and the bridges, and it's like, would we be capable of doing these major projects today like what was done back then? You need a lot of people. You need some commitment. You need resources. And are we putting in this kind of resources today? It just doesn't seem like it. There's a lot of talk about doing that. Okay. All right, can we go to the next slide? So in the exploitation of Mexican workers, and how did they justify this? Do you think race had something to do with it? Absolutely. There was a racial ideology that typically drove why these policies were put in place. Mexican workers were oftentimes forced to have to buy their tools and supplies from the company at what they called Mexican prices, which was not a discount, okay? They were often confronted with systematic discrimination where they were denied promotions and opportunities to advance in the industry or to move up the economic ladder or get better jobs and all that kind of stuff. If you were injured, if you were hurt, back-related problems often were very common for railroad workers. You had things like amputations, missing fingers, toes, and busted limbs. Were very common. Sometimes buried alive. People had to deal with those, whatever was out there, right? There was no health or medical insurance if you were a railroad worker, or workman's comp, or benefits, retirement or vacation days. Very rarely were there doctors that were actually at the work sites to deal with worker injury. You just didn't have that. They were just not on the radar screen of the employers. Their attitude was, we got to keep costs down, and we can't pay for any extras. And if you want to go work, you're going to have to just deal with it. So it's very cutthroat. And so it was a racial ideology of white supremacy, of the white race is superior, you're inferior, you're designed to work for us. And that's typically how this unequal treatment was rationalized. There was no other way to kind of sugarcoat it. And you can read some of the attitudes by some of these big business owners. I shared a few quotes. We'll look at a couple more here in a minute. Okay. Here in California, in the central Pacific, the Sierra Nevadas, where the Chinese workers, there were many people who were left out there to freeze in the snow, or you were working off the side of a cliff to make way for the rail lines, and you're working with dynamite. So there were deaths by working in these kinds of situations. Whether it was bridge building or making a cave, a tunneling in mountains and so forth. You can imagine that. Okay. All right, can we go to the next slide? Okay. All right, just another image of the railroad tracks. Let me read you a quote here. This is a federal official that oversaw the labor in 1913 had this to say about Mexican laborers. He said, as a laborer, the Mexican immigrant is said to be unambitious, physically not strong, and somewhat indigent and irregular. But against this is put the fact that he is docile, patient, orderly in camp, fairly intelligent under competent supervision, obedient and cheap. His strongest point with the employers is his willingness to work for a low wage. Were Mexican workers compliant like this? Were they that obedient? On the railroads, did they ever complain? Did they ever go on strike? Oh, yes, they did. Okay. Why would they want to be portrayed this way? Why would somebody want to portray them this way, though? That they are docile, that they are fairly intelligent if supervised. Why would somebody want to portray Mexican people in such a stereotypical way? Michael?
Maybe to keep them oppressed.
Yeah, keep them oppressed. And to justify keeping them oppressed, right? Typically, when you find negative stereotypes about a people, it's oftentimes because there's a desire to justify some unequal treatment. Somebody who's oppressing, oppressors, they want to be able to sleep at night without a guilty conscience, right? And so oftentimes arguments and rationales are created and made, right? And it was commonplace. Let's look at a couple more quotes here. John D. Rockefeller, one of the big industrialists, he said, God gave me my money. I believe the power to make money is a gift from God, to be developed and used to the best of our ability for the good of mankind. Having been endowed with the gift I possess, I believe it is my duty to make money and still more money, and to use the money I make for the good of my fellow man according to the dictates of my conscience. Wow. How does that sound? What do you make of that quote? A little bit of arrogance there, perhaps? Yeah. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was one of the industrialists that monopolized the railroad industry, right? Law? What do I care about law? Ain't I got the power? Huh? Yeah. Pretty. Why would he say that, do you think?
Connections he has with the government.
Yeah, do you think these powerful people had influence in Washington and with politicians who were making laws? Oh, big time, right? Jay Gould, one of the robber barons discussed in Zinn's book, right? I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half. What is he talking about here? What kind of attitude is this saying about how they saw the working class people? Tracy?
They weren't even human. They were just like a machine.
That's something you can play with, right? Watch, I can make them fight against each other. Watch, right? Very scary to see this kind of perspective, right? It's again going back to the way the dominant narrative in the traditional history books. These individuals are largely celebrated, right? Now, don't get me wrong; they help the economy, they do some good things, sure, but we got to also balance that out, right? I mean. Many of these individuals were also responsible for the suffering of a lot of people in the process, right? All right, you want a little bit more? Let's talk a little bit more about John D. Rockefeller, right? Here's another quote. If you want to succeed, you should strike out on new paths rather than travel the worn paths of accepted success. So how did he gain his wealth in the Standard Oil Company that he owned? What did he do? Well, it's kind of interesting because he there was kind of a double standard that he saw that the welfare or any way to help the poor or the sick or the oppressed was seen as making them weak and dependent, and you don't want people to become freeloaders. But yet, helping the big companies and giving them big breaks was not seen as any kind of handout, you know. A lot of what the strategies that he used to maintain his power and to amass the fortunes of the Rockefellers, right, was choking out competition, right? What did that mean? Well, you drop your prices so low that the smaller companies can't afford and they go out of business, okay? Keep wages very low. Pit workers against each other. You know, it's very common, like that one Jay Gould said, I get one half of the working class to kill the other. It was very common, and read in Acuna, he talks about intra-ethnic conflicts where workers were pitted against each other, often based on ethnic lines. This happened here in the Central Valley where Mexican workers were pitted against Filipino workers or Japanese workers. You know, they might be workers in one field that were Mexican workers, and the employers or the bosses would come over and say, hey, Mexican workers, you know, the Filipino workers, they think that you're lazy, and they make better workers, right? And then they go tell the Filipinos, hey, Filipino workers, you know what the Mexicans are saying about you, right? And just foment this prejudiced, you know, attitudes with each other as a way to get the workers to work more productively, right? And to pit them against each other and to prevent them from organizing and forming unions. Okay, it was a common strategy, right? Corporate welfare, right? Getting laws to help the big businesses instead of helping poor people, right? What is deregulation? You hear a lot of this today. What does deregulation mean? Yeah, Manny.
No red tape.
Yeah, removing regulations, right? So if you think about the role of our government, over here is the government, right? And really they're supposed to kind of protect everybody, right? Pass laws to protect everybody. But the fact is, this group here, isn't there a lot of money going that way? And influence, absolutely. So deregulation is basically the idea of removing existing laws that these people might see as a barrier to your ability to run your business. Okay? That's what deregulation means. Today, you hear conversation in Washington, D.C. today. The President Pinocchio over there is wanting to deregulate, right? Of course, he comes from the business world, right? And this is why he's so popular amongst wealthy business people, because he's seen as a friend, right? Oh yeah, you need to remove any kind of government laws that are too restrictive, right? Well, what kind of laws are we talking about? Well, these are typically like environmental protection laws, right? That protect you, the consumer, those kinds of laws, right? All right. And Rockefeller was notoriously known for crushing unionization, attempts for workers to unionize. Workers were often fired, or let's say you were a bunch of factory workers. Let's say, Michael, you were the leader. You were the one going around talking to the workers. Hey, man, we need to get organized, man. You need. Right? And Michael one day gets called over to the office, and next thing you know it, he's fired and he's gone. Not only that, his name is put on a list, right? And now that list is being circulated around other companies. So are you going to get hired anywhere else? Right? Oh man! And Rockefeller, he would send into the companies, spies, agent provocateurs, infiltrators, right? People who, all right, Joaquin, I'm going to pay you a little extra money. I want you to go and talk to go to that meeting over there, and I want you to report and tell me what they're talking about, right? That kind of thing. Right? Violence, repression, all kinds of things, right? So there's a flip side of the coin, right? Check it out in Howard Zinn, because he kind of flips this over, and kind of, rather than just give you the warm and fuzzy side of people like the Rockefellers, he kind of gives you from the bottom up perspective. If you were a working class person back then, what did these people do for you or not? The secret of success lies in not in doing your own work, but in recognizing the right man to do it. Okay, and so goes Rockefeller, right? A lot of different strategies were used by industrialists to maintain this working class population. Okay,